Well, first of all, I would like to say a word of thanks for the very kind words of introduction which you have just heard. I would also like to say that my wife and I are very pleased to be honoured here in this way tonight. I would also like to commiserate with all of you that on a hot evening like tonight, you will have to listen to me for some time. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. Now, students in general do not realise that universities did not always have laboratories where they could learn to handle apparatus. And before about 1860 or 1870, there were very few universities in the world which were provided with laboratories. But this fashion started around about that time. Now, in Cambridge, there was no physical laboratory up to 1871. And the undergraduates did not have any practical experience. The professors had to carry out their research in their own homes, and many of the well-known things which they did were done in their own homes with somewhat limited facilities and limited types of apparatus. Now, in Cambridge, there had been a long tradition of mathematics and its application really to physics. And this started in the time of Newton, and it persisted down over the times until the Cavendish Laboratory was set up. Now, most of the people, in fact nearly all of them, entered physics via mathematics. Cambridge had a very renowned school of mathematics, and students wishing to get high distinction at their degree examination had to take what was called the mathematical tripos. It had the reputation of being one of the most difficult examinations which a student anywhere would have to undertake. Now, in 1870, the Chancellor of Cambridge University was the 7th Duke of Devonshire, and he achieved high distinction in this tripos examination, having obtained 2nd place. And so he was interested in mathematics in Cambridge, but also in the establishment of experimental facilities for physics. And so he offered to the university a sum of somewhere around about £6,000, let us say $14,000 or $15,000. In those days it was quite a considerable sum, and of course naturally the university accepted it. It was to be used for the first physics department. Now, it was called the Cavendish Laboratory because Cavendish was the family name of the Dukes of Devonshire. But it was also named with one Henry Cavendish in mind. He was a sort of collateral ancestor of this Duke of Devonshire. Now, perhaps we might have a few slides if the ready to be shown. Now, the first slide shows you Sir Isaac Newton, and I have shown him here because I want to emphasize that he was both an undergraduate and an occasional professor of mathematics in Cambridge. And I think very few universities in the world could name more distinguished alumnus than Isaac Newton. Next slide, please. This shows a picture of Henry Cavendish. He was a very wealthy bachelor. He's shown there in the garb of the times. He was born in 1731 and died in 1810. But it might be more correct to say that he's wearing the garb of a previous age, because he was very conservative, and in order to save himself trouble and time, he left instructions with his tailor that on the 1st of every January he was to have ready for him a suit of clothes which was exactly the same as on the preceding 1st of January. So there was no great change there. Another peculiarity of his was that he seemed to have a horror of the opposite sex. He communicated with his housekeeper by means of notes left on the table in the entrance hall, and all his female servants had strict injunctions to keep out of his sight on pain of instant dismissal. I don't think that if he were here tonight, he would be very happy. Next slide, please. Now this slide shows the entrance to the Cavendish laboratory. It's not a very imposing entrance. The main door, which you see in the picture, is on a little narrow laneway. And on my first day in Cambridge, I had great difficulty in finding its most famous laboratory. I had passed the end of this little laneway several times. I said to myself, the Cavendish laboratory couldn't possibly be up that narrow laneway. But on inquiring of various people in the streets, I got no further. None of them had ever heard of the Cavendish laboratory. Well, eventually I found it. Now, if you follow that up, and go in through that door, you come out into a small courtyard. Is that better? Can you see? Can you go back? Down on the small screen. Inside this courtyard, and I would like to draw your attention to that tower that's up at the top. This was where Rutherford kept his store of radioactive materials. He had something like 1/3 of a gram of radium. It was put up there so that it would not contaminate the rest of the laboratory in which accurate measurements of radioactivity were being carried out. But I'm afraid that the precautions taken in that tower were very primitive, as judged by what we insist on today. Professor Devils, in an article written a few years ago, described how on one occasion he went up to that tower, and when he came down, he breathed out into a Geiger counter, and it went nearly mad. Next slide, please. Now, the Cavendish professorship was instituted in 1871, and the question of the most suitable person to appoint. They tried to get Lord Kelvin to accept, but he would not leave Glasgow. And the choice then fell on James Clerk Maxwell, whom you see in this picture. He was a Scotch man, had held a university appointment in Edinburgh, then became Professor of Physics in King's College in London, and in 1865 he retired to his home in Scotland. He was a person of some considerable private means and didn't have to hold a post. But he was persuaded to take on the Cavendish professorship. Now, he's well known for a number of things. He's known for his work on the kinetic theory of gases. We have Maxwell's law of the distribution of the velocities of the molecules of a gas. He's known for his work in thermodynamics. We have got Maxwell's 4 thermodynamic relationships. He's known for his work on color vision. But above all, he's known for his work on the electromagnetic theory of light, which is the basis of all of our calculations in electricity and magnetism today. Now, unfortunately, Maxwell was kept very busy organising classes in the Cavendish laboratory for several years, but also he regarded it as a pious duty that he should undertake the publication of a vast number of scientific papers which Henry Cavendish had left behind. It was a pity that he should have done this, for a lesser man than Maxwell could have carried out this job, and Maxwell would have been free to do greater things. Again, unfortunately, Maxwell died in 1879 when he was just 48 years of age. Next slide, please. The electors to the professorship again tried to get Lord Kelvin to accept the position, and again he refused. And the choice then fell on Lord Rayleigh, whom you see in the picture. Lord Rayleigh was a man of independent means and was rather unwilling to take on the responsibilities of administering this important university post. But he agreed to take it on for a period of 5 years. Now, Lord Rayleigh had a distinguished undergraduate career, obtained first place in the Tripos examination. He's known for quite a number of things, for his explanation of the blue light of the sky, for his work on the determination of the electrical constants, and perhaps he's best known for his work along with Sir William Ramsay in the discovery of the inert gases which are in the atmosphere, argon, neon, krypton, xenon. But he's also very well known for his work on vibrations and sound. His textbook on sound is still a very useful book to refer to whenever there's any problem involving wave motion or vibrations. A few years ago, I was interested in a problem of vibrations, and so I thought I would have a look to see if Rayleigh had dealt with the problem. I didn't find this in his textbook on sound, but I found it in his collected papers. There were 6 volumes of these papers, and he acted as editor of these, and they were published during his lifetime. Now, having found the solution to my problem in one of his published papers, I was turning over the pages of this volume, and I noticed that right at the beginning of the book, there was on a blank page what appeared to be a quotation, though it was not in quotation marks, and no reference was given at the end of it. I found out afterwards that it came from one of the Psalms, the 111th Psalm. And the words were, "The works of the Lord are great, and much sought out by those that take pleasure therein." Well, I wasn't quite sure whether the Lord was Lord really himself, or a greater Lord. And I've been trying to find out since then whether Lord Rayleigh was a person with a keen sense of humour, and so he stuck in the quotation, or whether he was a person with no sense of humour whatever and didn't see the funny side of things. Next slide, please. Maybe on back one. Now this is a less formal picture of Lord Rayleigh on the left and Lord Kelvin on the right, taken at his private laboratory at Tarling, not very far from London. Now, Lord Kelvin refused his Cavendish professorship on 3 occasions. He was very fond of Glasgow, and nobody could ever attract him away from Glasgow. The people of Glasgow thought the world of him. They almost worshipped him. And I'll tell you a story that illustrates that. When I was in Cambridge, I did some joint research work with Philip D., who later was appointed to the professorship held by Lord Kelvin. I met him one day, about 6 months or so after his appointment. And I said to him, "I suppose Kelvin's ghost still walks through the department." "Oh yes, indeed, it does," he said. And then he started to tell me about the troubles he had when he went there. He decided that the place needed a good spring cleaning. But every time he wanted to throw out what he thought was junk, there was always some member of the faculty spoke up and said that Lord Kelvin had something or other to do with it, and of course it was sacrosanct and had to be preserved. But he said the limit was reached one day when he was going round the department, and he found under one of the benches a big wooden box. He got it pulled out, and on the top of the box was a label, and it bore the words, "Glassware, broken by Lord Kelvin." Next slide, please. I've gone back 2 now. Now, when Lord Rayleigh finished his 5 years in Cambridge, he retired from the position, and the problem of a successor again arose. And the person chosen was quite a young person, J.J. Thomson. He was just 28 years of age at the time. And it's said that some of the senior professors in Cambridge were very disturbed at this appointment. They thought that things were coming to a terrible state of affairs in Cambridge when mere boys were being appointed as professors. But they seem to have forgotten that Sir Isaac Newton was appointed a professor in Cambridge when he was only 26 years of age. Now, his electors made no mistake in appointing J.J. Thomson. He had a long and successful reign of 35 years as director of the Cavendish Laboratory. And he decided, soon after taking up the position, that a profitable line of work would be to study the discharge of electricity through gases under low pressures. Low pressures would be desirable because the complicated phenomena would be likely to be easier to understand at low pressures. Things would be simpler then. Well, this led to the discovery by him of the electron in 1897. he built up a school which attracted people from all over the world. Now, next slide, please. J.J. Thomson became master at Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1919, and he resigned from the professorship. And the person chosen to succeed him was Ernest, who had come from New Zealand to work under J.J. Thomson way back in 1895, and had stayed in Cambridge for 3 years, and then went to McGill University, Montreal, as professor there. But while he was in Cambridge, he started investigating the radiations that came from uranium and thorium. He started in Cambridge at a very fortunate time when a lot of new things were happening. X-rays were discovered in December 1895, just after he arrived there, and the radioactivity of uranium was discovered a couple of months afterwards by Becquerel. Well, Rutherford continued with this work in McGill. I'll not go into the details of the various things he did there, but it was mainly unraveling the very complicated things that appeared in connection with this new found radioactivity. He was able to sort these out into different types of radiation, study their properties. And then, with the help of a chemist called Solly, he was able to separate out these radioactive substances and show that one of them would transform into another and it into another. You are in fact dealing with spontaneous change of one element into another. An idea that was very abhorrent to the chemists of the day. Next slide, please. Now, Rutherford, while he was in the Cavendish, when he was in Manchester, he left McGill University in 1907 and was in Manchester until 1919. While he was there, he did further work on radioactive substances, and the most fruitful line was studying the passage of alpha particles through matter. This way he got onto the scattering of alpha particles, and this in turn led to his introduction of what we call the nuclear model of the atom. Quite different model from what was at that time believed to be the structure of the atom, which was a model, an electrostatic model proposed by J.J. Thomson. Now, Rutherford, before he left Manchester in 1919, was able to show that nitrogen could be disintegrated by alpha particle bombardment. And he went to Cambridge, and that work was followed up. And he had a very successful time in Cambridge. I haven't time to go into the full details. But he died, unfortunately, in 1937 of something that really ought to have killed him. It was simply a strangulated hernia. The person chosen to succeed Rutherford was W.L. Bragg. And you see him there in the picture, with Lady Bragg on the left of him. Now, he had made a name for himself, the physicists here will know, in showing that the important thing, or one of the important things about X-rays, was that they were a tool for investigating crystal structures. And as a result of his work and the work of his father and various students, the crystalline structure of a great many materials was discovered. Now, to many people, this seemed a mistake. It was seen a mistake because all of the work on nuclear physics at the Cavendish would naturally take second place, and crystallography would take first place. People thought that perhaps Chadwick ought to have been appointed. He was the assistant director, and he could very well have carried on the Rutherford tradition. But again, the selectors didn't make any mistake, because as a result of the development of X-ray crystallography there, we had, after something like 20 years, the understanding of the complicated structure of these molecules like hemoglobin and so on, which are such great biological importance. Now, just to stop at that, as far as these professors, Cavendish professors are concerned, we had there a succession of people who were completely outstanding. And it's to this succession of able people that the Cavendish Laboratory hold the fame and high esteem which was held. Next slide, please. Now, I have a few less formal pictures to show you, and this one here shows Rutherford on your right and J.J. Thomson on the left. It was always known throughout Cambridge as just J.J. Now, I'm very fond of this picture because it's absolutely characteristic of these two great physicists. Rutherford standing there with his left hand out, moving it up and down, emphasizing what he's saying to J.J. And J.J. standing there with a bowler hat on. He always seemed to have one clear at hand, and with his hands behind his back, listening to what Rutherford had to say. I've often seen J.J. Thomson in Cambridge taking up that stance. He would walk round and down, he would stop in front of a shop window and gaze into it. It didn't seem to matter what was in that shop window, whether it was a hardware shop or a grocery shop, or whether it was ladies' millinery in the shop window. They all seemed to interest him equally, but it was generally held opinion that J.J. wasn't at all interested in what was in the shop window. He just took this as an opportunity to think about some problem that he was engaged on at the moment, and that his thoughts were very far removed from the contents of the window in front of him. However, after his death, people were not quite so sure that J.J.'s head was always up in the air, because he left behind him, as his biographer relates, a sum of £100,000, well over $200,000. And the problem which his biographer posed was this: how did J.J., who started from virtually nothing, never had anything more than a teacher's salary, accumulate a sum of this magnitude? And the answer was that he was really a very astute man. And when he had any money, he knew exactly where to put it. He actually was very fond of getting into conversation with financiers and other people of that sort. And it said that if the fellows of Trinity College, Cambridge, had listened to their master for his advice on financial affairs, that the college would have done much better than it actually did do. Now, the Cavendish Laboratory, although it had a great reputation, was really very poor for many years. The money allocated for equipment and so on was quite inadequate to buy the necessary equipment for the ever-increasing number of research students who wanted to work there. And the result of this was that great care had to be taken not to waste anything in the Cavendish Laboratory. For example, when a piece of research was finished, it was disassembled. The pieces of wood were stacked up in one corner of the workshop to be used over again. The wooden screws, although rusty, were put in a box to be used over again. Bits of wiring, electric wiring, about the old times in the Cavendish laboratory, and told the following story about J.J. J.J. was in his office, and he had a very important visitor with him. A knock came to the door. "Come in," says J.J., and the door opened cautiously, and a head appeared round the door. It was the head of what was known as the laboratory steward. We might describe him as the chief technician in the laboratory. J.J. didn't like to be disturbed. He was a little bit quick with Fred Lincoln, who was the person concerned, and he said, "Don't you see I'm busy? Can't it wait? Is the matter very important?" "Oh, yes, sir," said Lincoln. "Well, what is it?" said J.J. "Oh, sir, it's the bucket." "Well, what about the bucket?" said J.J. "It's got a hole in it," said Lincoln. "Well, can't you mend the holes?" said J.J. "Well, sir," said Lincoln, "we've already mended 9 holes in that bucket, and this one is too big to mend." So on the strength of that plea, the distinguished director of the Cavendish laboratory wasted I don't know how many minutes of his time in authorizing the purchase of so simple a bit of equipment as a bucket. Now, Chadwick, in telling this story, spoke about the bucket all the time. Apparently, there was only one bucket. Now, I must keep my eye on the time. There are many stories told about J.J. Thomson, and I just mentioned another of them. J.J. Thomson gave, as a birthday present to his son, George Thomson, a microscope. A very good present for any physicist to give to his son. And his son, by the way, became famous in his day as the first person, along with Davison in the United States, to show the wave nature of the electron. By the way, J.J. got a Nobel Prize for finding the electron and showing it as a particle. His son got a Nobel Prize for showing it as a wave. Now, about this microscope. They had some visitors in the house, and of course, George was very proud of the microscope and was showing this visitor various objects under the microscope. And he put in a human hair. And the visitor, when he saw this, spent a long time peering through the microscope at this hair. And eventually, he withdrew from the microscope, and J.J., who was there at the time, asked him, did that last slide particularly interest him? He seemed to have spent a long time on it. "Oh," he said, "I was looking for the number. You see, it says in the Bible that the hairs of our head are all numbered." Next slide, please. Now here's another picture showing Rutherford on the left and J.J. on the right, complete with bowler hat. And Rutherford is showing J.J. to his seat for the annual Cavendish photograph of faculty and research students. And that smile on J.J.'s face was characteristic of him. I've often seen him in the course of a lecture when he would make some sort of provocative statement and then wait for a minute or two for a response from the audience. He would put that smile on his face. Unfortunately, the smile was sometimes spoiled by his upper denture dropping on the lower one. Next slide, please. Here is a picture of Rutherford talking to Searle, who was a very good teacher of practical physics, and he lived to be a great age. He was a bit of a character, And again you see Rutherford with his left arm out, moving it up and down, emphasizing what he's saying to Sir. Now if you could move the picture a little bit further over, you'll see the back of Aston, F.W. Aston, who spent all his life working on isotopes, getting the isotopes constitution of the various atomic species. He was a bachelor whose second interest in life was in attending eclipse expeditions, and for quite a number of years he held the record for the number of attendances. Next slide, please. Now this is a picture of James Chadwick, who in 1932 discovered the neutron. He was the assistant director of the Cavendish laboratory for, I think, virtually all of Rutherford's tenure of the position. He had been Rutherford's assistant in Manchester, and when Rutherford went to Cambridge, he came along with Rutherford. Now, he has on his face there a rather fearsome appearance. That was the look that he reserved for new research students starting off on the research, so that we get the message right from the beginning. When you got to know him, he really could be very helpful and very nice too. Next slide, please. This was a picture which I managed to get one day of C.T.R. Wilson, the inventor of the Wilson cloud chamber, which, as the physicists here will know, has been of enormous importance in the development of nuclear physics. Because by its means, it's possible to follow just exactly what each individual particle, like an alpha particle or a beta particle, is doing in any particular experiment. And indeed, Rutherford described this invention of C.T.R. Wilson as the ultimate court of appeal in all matters of nuclear physics. Now, C.T.R. Wilson got interested in clouds, and this was the method used for making visible the track of these particles. He got interested when he was an undergraduate at Cambridge, and one vacation he took on a vacation job, which was to spend the summer at the top of Scotland's highest mountain, Ben Nevis, and there to make meteorological observations. Well, while he was on the top of that mountain, he had every opportunity to watch the formation of clouds and the disappearance of clouds as they moved down the mountain on one side and up on the other. Now, he made up his mind that if he ever had an opportunity to do research, it would be on the subject of the formation of clouds. And this led eventually to his expansion chamber. Now, he was a very quiet, kindly person, and very far from being one of the world's great lecturers. He had an unfortunate habit in a lecture of giving you the first half of a sentence. And then there would be a long pause, and you'd get the second half. And the two halves would make sense to you if you could remember the first when you got the second. Now, for this reason, very few people attended his lectures. And I can remember one afternoon, he always lectured late in the afternoon. There was an argument between some of the research students. The argument was about whose turn it was to go and listen to C.T.R. Now, he was a very good experimenter. He had an infinite amount of patience. In those days, people had to make their own glassware. They hadn't got a glass worker, glass blower in the Cavendish laboratory. And Walton spent a long time making very amateurish looking thing out of the glass. When C.T.R. Wilson is reported on one occasion to have completed a piece of glassware, spent a long time on it, and then as he let it cool down, finally there was an ominous crack, which of course meant that he really had to start from the beginning because it wasn't properly annealed. But instead of using strong language, all that C.T.R. Wilson said was, oh dear, and he started all over again. Rutherford tells the story of how when he was leaving Cambridge for Montreal, that he went into C.T.R. Wilson's room to say goodbye to him. And he found him on the bench, grinding two pieces of glass together. This was to form a valve for one of his expansion chambers. And he sat there grinding this valve. 2 years later, Rutherford returned to the Cavendish and went to see C.T.R. Wilson. And Rutherford swore that he was still sitting at that table with the same two pieces of glass. Rutherford told this story at a Cavendish dinner in Cambridge, which was really to celebrate C.T.R. Wilson's award, the award to C.T.R. Wilson of the Nobel Prize. And C.T.R. Wilson, of course, heard the story, and he didn't deny the accuracy. Next slide, please. Well, I think we'll cut out that. It's a well-known picture showing disintegration of nitrogen. Now, I just show you a few slides of some of the people who were on the physics faculty at the time when I was there, which was from 1927 to 1934. And there's a picture of Kapitsa standing in front of the large machine which he used for sending very large currents through coils in order to produce exceptionally strong magnetic fields. Needless to say, the money for that didn't come out of the Cavendish funds. It was a special grant that had been obtained from the, I think it was the Royal Society. Well, Kapitsa one summer went back to his native Russia for a vacation. The Russians thought they needed him for the 5-year plan then in operation and didn't allow him to return to Cambridge. Next slide, please. Now here's another picture of Rutherford talking to Radcliffe. And I want you to notice in particular that notice that's up above. It was actually an illuminated notice, talk quietly, please. And this notice was put up because in that room they were doing counting of alpha particles by the method then common of using a thin ionization chamber connected to an amplifier and the output fed into a mechanical oscillograph. Now this chamber acted like a microphone, and if there was any noise, it produced an effect which just swamped the effect of the alpha particles. And so people were warned not to talk loudly in this room. But the notice was more directly erected for the benefit of Rutherford, because he had a large booming voice and he would come into the laboratory talking at the top of his voice, and any counting being done at the time was just wrecked. Next slide, please. Now this shows a group of people who were working in that room that you saw just a minute ago, and they're standing around a magnet which is sitting on the floor. It was a magnet which was designed by Cockcroft for the bending of alpha particles round in a semicircle, so that you could study in detail the structure of the alpha ray spectrum. Previous to this had been done in Paris by Rosenblum using the very large Coton magnet there, magnet about 100 tons, and it was difficult to keep the magnetic field constant. Well, the magnet this size, which did the job just as well, something like 200 watts of power was all that was needed, and this could be obtained from a storage battery. The result was that Rutherford and the students working with him got a lot of detailed information about the long-range particles from barium C- and thorium C-. The story is told that one day Rutherford was showing a visitor around in the laboratory and he came to this magnet. And the visitor asked Rutherford how much the magnet cost. Well, Rutherford said it cost a lot of money. It cost about £250, as much as would keep a research student for a whole year. But of course it does a lot more work, he said. Next slide, and I think we can cut out the next two slides. That shows you just what I was talking about a moment ago, the analysis of the alpha-ray spectrum. Next slide, please. Now, the time when I was there was a very good one because we had a lot of visits from famous physicists. Rutherford would bring these people around the laboratory, introduce them to the young research students, and so you had a chance of meeting in person a lot of those whose names you were familiar with. This picture shows one taken on the occasion of a Beta and Gamma Ray conference of Hans Geiger on the left and de Broglie on the right. This is the Geiger of Geiger counterfeit. Next slide, please. This shows you the Joliot-Curie's, Irene on the left and Frederick on the right. They were visitors also at that conference that I mentioned. Next slide, please. This is one of Niels Bohr, whose name, of course, is connected with Rutherford. We have the Rutherford-Bohr model of the atom. He was in Manchester at the time Rutherford gave his ideas, and as you know, Bohr filled in the mathematical details and was able to give a very precise explanation of the spectrum of hydrogen. Rutherford and Bohr were very great friends, and nearly every year Bohr would visit the Cavendish laboratory, and Rutherford would usually get him to give at least one lecture. Next slide, please. Another visitor this time was Erwin Schrödinger, the inventor of the wave mechanics. Rutherford got him to give us a series of 4 lectures on the then new wave mechanics. I got to know him very much better when we went to the Institute for Advanced Studies in Dublin and spent somewhere around about 13 or 14 years with us there. Next slide, please. Now this shows you one of these annual photographs of the faculty and research students. The faculty down at the bottom, I don't think that will be visible to many people, but people like Rutherford, C.T. Wilson, J.J. Thompson, Chadwick, and a few others are in that front row. Now, actually, at that time, there were on the staff or shortly afterwards, something like 8 people who had been awarded Nobel Prizes for their work. Recently, somebody asked me how many Nobel Prizes were gained by workers in the Cavendish laboratory. I didn't know the answer, but I looked it up and I found that something like 22 people who had been working in the Cavendish laboratory had been awarded Nobel Prizes for their work. And I think if you remember that this is a single department in a university, not a whole university, that it is a very good record indeed. Next slide, please. This is a picture showing an acid room in the Cavendish laboratory where young research students from outside Cambridge were placed for their first few months in the Cavendish, so that they might gain acquaintance with some of the techniques which the Cambridge students were familiar with, but very few students from elsewhere had ever the opportunity of gaining any experience in. Now, you generally stayed there for something like 3 months, and at the end of that time, Rutherford would send for you in order to discuss your line of research. That room was nicknamed the nursery. Next slide. Well, now, I'm afraid I got that one in the wrong order. Would you just let us see the following one first? Yes. Well, when my turn came to go to Rutherford to discuss research, I put up to him a suggestion about a method of producing fast particles without the use of high voltages. And later on, when for various reasons that I haven't time to go into now, this method didn't work. I suggested another method to him, the method of the linear accelerator, which he started to work on. But to cut a long story short, because of the application of the new wave mechanics to problems of particles going through barriers, it could be seen that the very energetic particles thought to be necessary for disintegration of elements were not really necessary at all. That quite low energy particles could penetrate through the barriers around the nuclei of atoms. A chance of penetration would be very small, but because you could produce enormous numbers of particles artificially, you could still get a great many particles into the nuclei of atoms. So I stopped working on these indirect methods of producing fast particles. Cockcroft, who was working on the bench next to me on a very different topic, hadn't anything to do with nuclear physics, gave up his research. We joined forces to carry out what we call the brute force method of just producing a high voltage and accelerating our particles. And after spending a good deal of time getting vacuum tubes that would stand up to the necessary voltages, we produced this rather ancient-looking apparatus, which you see in the photograph there. It would produce something like 700,000 volts and produce streams of protons of something of the order of about 50 or 100 microamperes. That doesn't sound a very big current, but when you remember that 2 microamperes of protons has as many particles in it as are emitted by 150 grams of radium in 1 second, you can see that you're dealing with very large numbers of particles. And of course, you just couldn't buy it with money, 150 grams of radium, and even if you had it, you couldn't use it in the experiment. You'd have to just take a small piece of it. Next slide, please. Now, if you go back to that shows you the bottom of the apparatus in which we accelerated the particles, and the particles came out down below. And sitting on the stool there, you'll see a photograph of my back taken many years ago. And we were able to show that the lithium was bombarded by protons. One got the lithium split up, giving 2 out of the particles. Next slide, please. Now, in order to be quite sure of what was happening, PID, whom I mentioned, came in to help us, and we got an expansion chamber working under the apparatus. The protons came down there, right down into the expansion chamber down at the bottom. And the target there was surrounded by thin magnet so that these particles could get out. And the next slide, I can show you a picture of these. You can see a lot of these alpha particles coming out. They are the results of disintegrations of lithium atoms. And when you remember that that's the number of particles which were disintegrated in about 50th of a second, and when you remember that we had to cut down the proton current to quite a small value in order to get sufficiently few particles to distinguish the tracks, you can see that we had plenty of leeway once you got these disintegrations going. Next slide, please. This shows you the different appearance of bombarding heavy hydrogen, bombarding lithium with heavy hydrogen, you've got alpha particles, all sorts of ranges coming out, some of them going as far as over 12 centimeters. Now I see that the time is going on, and perhaps I might just come back to Rutherford once more. I was talking to him after lunch this morning, and I don't want to repeat anything I said then, but I did refer to the poverty of the Cavendish laboratory in those days. And I just tell you a story in connection with that. As it was told to me by Chadwick, just a year or two before he died, I paid him a visit in Cambridge, and he told me the following story. He said he was coming down from that tower one day with Rutherford, and he was telling Rutherford, well, sorry, no, I think I'd better start at a different point in the story. He started the story in Keats College in Cambridge. Chadwick was having a dinner there one night, and after it was over, he and the master were the only people left in the common room. And the master, Sir Hugh Anderson, turned to Chadwick and said to Chadwick, "Why wouldn't Rutherford take that money?" "What money?" said Chadwick. And then Anderson told Chadwick the story. Now I want you to bear in mind that Chadwick was the assistant director of the Cavendish laboratory. And the story was this, that Sir Hugh Anderson had a great opinion of Rutherford and of the work he was doing in Cambridge. And he knew that the laboratory needed far better financing than was possible out of the monies allocated to the university. So he went to some of his relative friends and got them to agree to raise a sum of £2,000 for a number of years for the use of Rutherford. And all Rutherford had to do was to say that he needed so much of this money and would be paid straight away to him. Rutherford would have nothing to do with this. And Chadwick couldn't understand this at all. Rutherford hadn't consulted Chadwick about it. He hadn't consulted anybody about it. But Chadwick said that he thought he understood the reason sometime later. When he was coming down from that tower with Rutherford one day, and he said to Rutherford that he was having great difficulty in providing enough radioactive sources for all the research going on in the Cavendish laboratory. That he really needed more radium. And Chadwick said to Rutherford, "Isn't it a pity that some organization or another did not do for you what the women of America did for Madame Curie, namely subscribe and die for her a gram of radium?" And Rutherford's reaction was, "I'm very glad we didn't. Just imagine if I had a whole gram of radium, how could I justify the use of that in this laboratory? They'd be wanting reports about what I was doing with it every year, and it just wouldn't be worth it." Now, Rutherford, since his death, has been very severely criticized by some of the people who were working in the Cavendish laboratory system for not making greater effort to get money for the department. He was, at the height of his fame, the Cavendish laboratory was famous, and it should have been very easy to get the money. That just reminds me of my last story about Rutherford. He really was a very modest person, very simple person, despite his great distinction in his connection with his discoveries. But on one occasion, it didn't look as if he was modest. He met one of his colleagues one day when he was making his name in connection with radioactivity. And this colleague said to him, "You're the lucky man, Rutherford, to come in on the crest
of this wave of radioactivity. And Rutherford didn't like this at all, and he turned on him and said, "But didn't I make the wave?" Now, of course, it was perfectly true. He did make that wave. And generally speaking, he was very modest indeed about his great achievement. Now, I must apologize to you for talking to you so long, but I did find that you were listening to me very intently, and so I was encouraged to go on. I looked round, I didn't see anybody looking at their watches. They say that you don't really have to pay attention to people when you see them looking at their watches when you're giving a lecture, but when they take their watches off their wrists and shake the watches and put them in their hands, that's the time to stop. So with that, I will stop.